first speaker of the night is Max Gendler, and I'm hoping I pronounced that right, the last name. What's exciting about Max is he works for the New York Times. He has a background in a little more on the technical end of the spectrum and is now moving more and more towards policy, just like the rest of the industry, I might say. So I'm very curious on what he wants to discuss with everyone here. And correct me if I'm wrong, Max, but the way you wanted to do this is a little bit more in discussion format, right? So we have two main questions that you want to explore. Would you also be open for questions from the audience?
Yes, absolutely. I think at any point that anyone from the audience would like to ask a question, I'm sure we can field it. I think discussion, especially in half an hour, is the best way to do this because data ethics is a massive subject that absolutely cannot be covered in a half hour. So hopefully this can be more of like an illuminating discussion along the lines of just peeling back a layer and letting people see inside a little.
Cool. So we've prepared two questions that are going to be the main focus of today's topic. And the first question is, you work at the New York Times, so you have a bit of an overview of what scale might be like. I don't know exactly, but I believe the New York Times is definitely one of the more popular newspapers, media outlets of the United States. So what does it mean to think about ethics at scale? What is your perspective on that?
So one of the things that we have to think about a lot when we're just naturally in the world is how we interact with people, right? And when you look at sort of the textbook definition of ethics, a lot of the conversations rely around your duty to your fellow man or how you interact. What are you doing and how does that affect other people? When we work in technology, a lot of the times we are separated from the people that we're actually affecting, and they're separated from us. There's a lot of things that are not necessarily obvious to someone in a situation of how they're interacting with their technology and what's happening to their information while it's happening. One of the best sort of examples that we use of how this gets obfuscated is if you have someone in your home, right, and you've invited them in, anything you do isn't private, right, because you've invited someone into your space. But if someone's standing outside your window and looking inside, that's a violation of your privacy. In the case of technology, it can be very hard for people to understand that when they're using technology, that they are inviting outside actors into their home in a lot of ways that they possibly would feel their privacy would be violated. So ethics at scale means understanding that your user is not always aware of what's happening and that you have to be proactive in how you think about their privacy and setting up your systems for success.
If I were to translate that to sort of active empathy, would you agree with that notion?
Active empathy, that's a good way to think of it, for sure. I think, one of the things that, again, when you obfuscate someone on the internet, I'm sure we've all done this in forums, right? Where you're talking to someone and they're disagreeing with you and the conversation can just escalate and escalate. It's usually because you're not putting a face to the person or you're not having like a normal conversation with a human. Having that sort of idea of, I need to empathize with the people I'm interacting with, even though I don't know exactly who they are or how this affects them, is a very good way of thinking about it, for sure.
And would you say that that's because in tech we are a little bit more distant from the end users, that's harder to do? Or is it like a more of a tech problem in your perspective?
I think it's a problem that can manifest itself in a lot of different ways, but tech is obviously no different from the rest of the world, where we're all humans, right? At the end of the day, no matter how much we try to outsource our jobs to algorithms, they are created by humans. Their biases that are inherent in humans are able to make their way into algorithms. They're able to make their way into the way we set up our systems. So I wouldn't go so far as to say we're more likely to run into these problems in tech, but it is one of those things that everyone should be conscious of as you're working.
So, what I can imagine, at least, and I'm going to paraphrase here, and the team that I'm talking about doesn't exist. I would just like to make sure that that's clear. But let's say there's a team, and there's a data team, and let's say the data team, they have to do recommender stuff for, let's say, some company that sells some sort of product. And I can imagine that the person who's investing at that point in time in that team, in that project, they want to see a return on investment. So quite quickly, you get this interesting dimensionality reduction to whatever you're doing. It's a single number. We have to optimize that. And I can imagine in such a situation, it's hard to bring up this topic of empathy. Even though, if I think about it from a risk perspective, it is actually quite interesting to think about it that way. I don't know if this sort of thing happens a lot at the New York Times, but I am curious, do you have any advice for these sorts of teams on how to maybe approach this?
Yes, that's a wonderful question, because I think it more or less relates to 90% of the kind of work I do, which is the space of data governance is in a lot of ways the role of translating between data science, pure tech people, and business stakeholders, right? It's this understanding that there are business people who are maybe very well intentioned but don't speak the language of data science. And there are data science and tech people who are very well intentioned but don't speak the language of business, right? So the first thing, whenever you come to someone and they're saying, this is the objective, this is the only objective, first, you have to understand why that's the objective. And in the case that you brought up, right, the business can have a final revenue goal. They might have just a
market share.
We need to get our stock up. We need a market share. Yeah, all of that, right? But what you also mentioned in that question, risk, is perfect, because you can counterbalance this idea of make as much money as possible now with this idea of long-term, what is our business? What are we thinking of? How are we going to move forward forever? Because you can get $50 today and never make another buck in your life. That's not really that great. But if you tell someone we can make $40 today and $20 tomorrow and $20 the day after and $20 the day after, and explain to them that there are actually a lot of reasons that privacy and ethics and this idea of thinking about your users and what's good for them can pay dividends in the fact that users do, to some extent, understand when a company is being trustworthy, when a company is dealing with them properly. And it's not always explicit. It's not always something that they can necessarily, formulate out loud. But there are feelings of trust and privacy that do play into the average consumer's thought process, whether it's your news organization, which should obviously build itself almost entirely on trust, to maybe a cloud service provider like AWS or Google, right? We also all think about how much we trust these systems to treat us fairly, whether or not we actively put that to paper.
I can also imagine. So I think it's nice to be able to say, okay, let's keep risk in mind whenever you're having that conversation, right? If you're setting a team up, etc. Are you maybe also aware of like projects where they really started to emphasize like the empathy and like making sure that we have the checklist up in order? Do you know of any industry stories that you can share where, hey, that was actually a good thing we've made that investment? These stories are just getting out, is my impression.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that ends up happening is a lot of these efforts get wrapped under company secrecy, right? They get wrapped under this idea that we have to keep our strategy under wraps. So there's only ever a few things that come out at a time. But I can share something from the New York Times that I was involved in a few years ago. So at the time, I was within the advertising analytics group, and we were starting to come up with projects with data governance involvement about how do we advertise to our users in a more ethical, privacy-forward way. And the first project we started was a contextual targeting project called Project Feels. In that project, what we were doing is using some survey data that we gathered off-site about how people reacted to headlines and summaries of our articles. We attempted to model how any of our articles might make a reader feel to some extent, right? We're not saying 100% of the time a reader is going to feel this way, but we're trying to get indicators of these articles about weddings are making people feel happy, right? That's a very obvious conclusion, but these are the kinds of things that can sometimes come out of models. So obviously there was...
Yeah. So out of curiosity, I can assume there was some sort of survey done, perhaps offsite, because you mentioned it was offsite, where like people literally looked at people's emotions as they were reading certain pieces. That what gave you a data set, and this was the basis of your work. This is accurate, right?
Yes, and I can also share a few presentations that our data science team has done about this over the past few years in the Discord afterwards, because I do think it's a very good case study of how to create a model that is meant to preserve privacy for the user.
Okay, now so that was the other direction I was also thinking about, but do go on because I think this is an interesting.
Yeah. But the point being is, at the end of the day, right, once this model is created, you have, for every article in the New York Times, a list of associated emotions. Some might have no emotions, some might have multiple, right, anywhere in between, right? Those emotions then were used as contextual targeting for advertising. So an advertiser could come to us and say, I want to place my ad on pages that you've classified as happy or love or sad or inspired, right? All of these then take the advertising revenue that we would have gotten from behavioral targeting, third-party data, any sort of things that are less privacy preserving, and started slowly moving that towards privacy preserving advertising. And at first, companies are skeptical, right? You need time for a new product to be proven out. You get one or two major players to use this advertising product. You have to take time to make sure the case studies look good. You have to make sure that you're actually getting good information.
Because I can also imagine there's negotiations happening in the background with this, I'm assuming, because some people buy in the ads and they want to know they get the return on investment. So it's not just technical, also salespeople are involved here, I suppose.
Yes. I mean, it's across the whole organization, right? So in terms of who's involved, there's data science, data engineers, obviously for pipelining, data analysts, that would have been me at the time, just keeping track of how the campaigns themselves are doing. You need ad tech people on the ground to make sure that the models are properly integrating into the ad tech stack. You need ad product team members who are going to make sure that the ad sales teams are properly informed about what they're selling and how it works, and to jump onto calls if there's questions. Sometimes I would jump onto calls if there were very serious questions. And you need buy-in across the entire advertising org to even go ahead, right? Because you need resources in order to fund the creation of the models in the first place.
So exactly, so this is not a proof of concept we're talking about. That's getting clearer and clearer. This is a pretty big undertaking, this one.
Yes. And so in terms of how we got that initially up to being one of our more successful products is first you talk to a few premium clients, ones that you know from the past have been interested in experimenting with different advertising formats. You talk to them and you might say, hey, here's a new format. We know your regular ad buy for the fourth quarter is coming through. Why don't we throw in 200,000 impressions on this new topic, this new project that we've got? And you can tell us if you like it. It's no cost to you. We'll do it. It's just a bonus on top of your usual buy. Then we'll give them a presentation at the end of it. Your regular advertising did this kind of return on investment. This advertising that we threw in for free, even if you had paid for it, made this return on investment. That sort of comparison helps you shift the perspective that less information about a user is necessarily worse, right? Because advertisers especially have been in an industry that for so long has said, we need to know everything about a user in order to properly micro-target and make sure that we're getting every last penny back in returns. And that's just not necessarily the case. It's not saying that any approach that doesn't use micro-targeting will work. That's obviously not the truth. You can't just blindly paste advertisements across the web and hope it'll work. But slowly changing the narrative from none of this works to, well, this product works. And now we're developing the next product and the next product, and constantly trying to make sure that we're both catering to what advertisers want, as well as making sure that our users are protected from invasive data privacy.
In this particular, So you might have heard of Vicky Boykes. It's a data science blogger, someone I'm a pretty big fan of. And one thing that this reminds me of, I can also imagine that in order to do this new kind of advertising that's a little bit more safe on the privacy spectrum, you're probably going to require way less data to handle and keep around as well. So there's also logistical benefits in this particular case. I can't imagine. If there's less data you need, then there's an upside to that as well.
Yes, I think that to us, in terms of just the cost of storage, we run on mostly Google systems, so Google BigQuery and Google Cloud Store. So in terms of the cost on our logs, I'm not sure we've ever looked into that directly, but I imagine in comparison to the overarching consumer data privacy concerns, that's sort of lower on our list of priorities. But it certainly does have, I mean, at a large enough scale, removing any amount of data from an individual log obviously does have an effect in storage costs and processing time.
Okay. So that could plausibly, at some point in time, especially with GDPR, one could imagine that storing data and keeping it around, it's going to be more and more expensive in the future, one can imagine. So that might also be another thing to keep in mind as you're having these sort of ethical discussions with your team at some point. Back in the old days, everyone was like a cookie monster to get all the data and we'll figure out later what to do with it. And I can imagine now that the negative aspects of that are becoming more apparent and therefore also more costly.
Right. And I think that's the exact sort of phrasing that can help bridge that gap between tech and business. It's not just that this data isn't useful or this data is not privacy preserving. This data is costly. You can take these concepts that we have and phrase them in ways that business people can understand better and engage in a conversation to help move them more towards a privacy-driven future.
Yeah, and risk also definitely makes a return here as well. Yeah.
Yes.
Certainly true. Cool. So, as far as timing goes, that was the first major theme that we had, and then it's also halfway, so that's definitely nice. But we had a second question that we figured would be nice to discuss. Why is it important to have data-first people working on these problems? And this also is part of your introduction, because you have a technical background as well. I don't know what you did in college, but I'm assuming it wasn't just philosophy, so to say.
Not even a little.
No, but like you came from the, I would argue, more technical spectrum and then moved into this direction. And I can definitely imagine that you have an opinion on why you bring something to the table that's useful in this discussion.
Yes. So obviously with GDPR and in California, there's a consumer privacy law also called the CCPA that's on the state level. A lot of these are written from the perspective of lawyers and policy people. They can have a lot of good intentions, but they might not necessarily understand how things work from the ground up, right? There are sections of the GDPR, for example, that allow major tech companies to self-classify whether they're a controller or a processor, as opposed to a regulatory committee being able to say, we think you're this, that means you are, right? These kinds of, I wouldn't go so far as to call them loopholes, but these kinds of slight misunderstandings between policymakers and tech companies can lead to massive differences in how the laws are actually enforced and how companies react to them, as opposed to what the policymakers think the reaction will be. So it's important that when you have privacy initiatives that you do get sort of this full group across your business, if possible, to be looking at it, because everyone can bring a slightly different perspective on how something works, right? We have, for example, at the New York Times, a wonderful lawyer who works with us internally, who is as good on data questions in terms of how the laws are structured, how they might affect our business, but every once in a while, you have to sit down and say, okay, this is how a data science model is constructed in general, right? There are questions that I'll answer in a meeting with legal, and they'll say, okay, is this something we could like publish in a blog post, or is this like a secret that we don't want to tell anyone? I'm like, this is the first chapter of a textbook in your 101 computer science class. And it's not that they are not smart. It's not that they don't know what in the world they're talking about. It's just they haven't been looking in this direction for their whole lives. This isn't their main focus. So being able to bring that different information to them is very helpful and can bring a lot of clarity to a conversation.
Would I be correct in saying that something similar happens with, I suppose, a security professional? Like you can be, let's say, a data scientist, but then you probably in your team, depending on what you do, you'd still like to have something of a security specialist around just to make sure that your data is handled correctly. Is it a fair comparison?
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of, this is obviously something that's much easier to do in a large organization like ours, but being able to have as varied a team as possible allows you to look at any single problem from different perspectives, right? Even if everyone has ended up as a data scientist, right? Having a data scientist who came from an academic background, or having a data scientist who came from an infosec background, or a data scientist who came from data analysis, or the data scientist who used to be a school teacher and just taught themselves data science, all of these people can bring really different perspectives. And I think that just applies broadly across any endeavor. So having data people move into the policy space and be able to bring fresh perspectives to what can sometimes be seen as a relatively stilted and stale environment and sort of very legal talk and arcane details, it's good to be able to bring that in and help clarify questions in a different way.
So one thing I wonder, do you think that there's a recruitment problem in that sense in this space? Because I can imagine if you're a lawyer, then, if there's a lot of movement in the laws happening, then you're naturally attracted to that, I suppose, because it's in some sense you could argue it's innovation. And I think I also have to admit that I definitely know more data scientists who want to keep on doing the algorithm stuff than move into policy in that sense. So would you agree, is there a recruitment problem maybe here, or would you use different words?
I would disagree with calling it a recruitment problem. I think there's an awareness problem. It's something that, and I don't even think I'd go as far as calling it a problem. We have something that is expanding more and more. People's understanding of privacy in the digital age is expanding more and more. We have more comprehensive texts about this. If you look at relatively recently published books about, for example, The Age of Surveillance Capital by Shoshana Zuboff, right? These are books that are new and extremely comprehensive. That 3 years ago didn't exist. This singular text that defines why data tracking is so pervasive, how it affects everyday users, and why we should be concerned, right? I did not know about these issues myself 3 years ago. I can't say that I've always wanted to be in data governance. I've always wanted to do policy. These are things that happen naturally when people are exposed to more information about it. When they're made aware of a problem, they can feel that they can help solve that problem. And I think one of the things that I've seen a lot out of the data analytics and the data science world, and admittedly this is with some bias because that's where I come from, it's full of people that are interested in solving difficult problems at its core, right? The tool they're using now is Python or R or Lisp or Perl or whatever in the world they want to be using, right? But at the base of it, a lot of programmers are interested in solving hard, difficult to untangle problems. And data governance is full of those, I can assure you. So I think, especially what we've seen within the Times, is we have a lot of people that want to work with data governance from their specific teams. And if there's a slot that opens up on the team, they want to join it. That's what happened with me. I worked with data governance on the analysis of the GDPR's effect on our advertising business and the analysis of how CCPA might affect our business. But with each step, I wanted to go, well, now I want to, move over there if there's a possibility to, right? So it's one of those things where if you can expose more people to ethical thinking through whatever means, I think that a lot of data scientists would be interested in this kind of work.
I can certainly imagine how for an organization like the New York Times, it is relatively, it's hard for me to judge, of course, but it sounds easier to get started with this because I can definitely imagine as an organization, there's a need to also have expertise in this. And as you said, it's a relatively larger organization, so it's a little bit easier to find people of different expertises to come together and work on a project. Would you have any advice for companies that are perhaps a bit smaller? Let's say there's a data team and there's 3 people in it.
Yes,
that's everyone.
That's something we've run into quite a bit. We try to talk a lot with we're members of different publishing organizations, or we'll join the W3C for conversations, and you do run into a lot of companies that are interested. They want to do this kind of work. They're on board mentally, but their resources aren't that high. And I won't sort of name names on companies, but there are, for example, there's one where a publishing organization, very important, especially in the United States, has won some of the most prestigious awards throughout its long history. They have 2 lawyers.
Right. Yeah, that's a bottleneck.
Yeah. Right. And that's not even getting into the data science team, where like lawyers are something that is well known that a newspaper will need just on First Amendment questions alone, right? So there is certainly a lot of this going around where people are interested in getting involved and getting that work started, but don't know where to start and don't have necessarily the resources to start themselves. One of the things we try to do as a larger organization is have these sorts of conversations about, here's our general thought process. Here's how we work on these questions. We can't give you all the details, and we certainly don't intend on telling you what to do. But here's how we approach these problems. Here's how we think of them. And a lot of the times when it comes to smaller teams, a lot of that can just fall to individuals who want to take it on themselves. It's an unfortunate truth that work doesn't always get recognized by management or by whoever in the startup, or if it's not a startup.
But some people might. I can imagine that some people sort of hear the call, I suppose, and that's what we're sort of going towards, right?
Exactly. So you can take on yourself just starting those kinds of conversations, right? Whether it's in your own personal modeling practices, if you are going through and making sure that at every step you feel comfortable with how you're treating users and their privacy. And if someone says to you, hey, go scrape, Facebook and get everyone's data, you go, well, maybe I don't want to do that. Let's have a conversation about it. Those are relatively easy steps that any individual can take on. And I think it's in a similar way, the more that an individual can make their company aware of ethical questions and concerns, people generally are not blind to them once they're put in front of them. It's just sometimes people don't think about them. So an easy way to get started is to just get started. Don't
know if I'm phrasing it the right way, but
yeah, it's that classic line. At the beginning of all that begatting, something begun, right?
Yeah,
it takes an individual at some stages. And for us, for the New York Times, that happened when 2.5 years ago, the head of our team was hired. He, obviously a higher up made the decision that we needed to hire someone for this purpose. And that was brought on by the GDPR coming into effect and us trying to get ahead of it.
They got the ball rolling, and then,
Yeah, but then he hired someone from one part of the company to work for him. And then they worked with another person. They said, oh, that person's pretty good at this. Let's bring them onto our team. And slowly expanding and slowly proving out how useful the team is, that it's not a cost to the company, that it's actually useful to be thinking about ethics and useful to try to make yourselves better as a company.
Cool. So we don't have too much time left, but I think we can leave on a couple short ones. So I can imagine that there are people right now listening who are interested and maybe want to learn more. And I also see some questions coming in. You mentioned the book just before. Could you? What was the name of the book again?
So it's called The Age of Surveillance Capital by Shoshana Zuboff. It's really an excellent book. Talking about surveillance capitalism and how it affects our day-to-day lives. If someone wants a little bit more of a technical text that talks about how you can do better in your modeling practices, I would suggest a book called Bit by Bit by Matthew Solganic, who is at Princeton University and does quite a lot of research around sociologically, how do we make sure that our modern practices for research, and especially academic research, are ethical and don't affect the users that we are running experiments on. So those two books, I think, are excellent for anyone that's interested in the subject.
Cool. Books are always good for personal inspiration in that sense. So that advice is definitely welcome. So thanks. This was like a little short interview talk in that sense. So it was also and virtual. So we're doing like multiple things for the first time. Max, thanks a whole bunch. Will you also be on the Discord forum? Do you have access to that?
Yes, I'll be on the Discord. Anyone that has any questions, please feel free to reach out either in the talk chat or personally if you have questions that you like to keep private. Vincent, thank you so much for having me.
It's been fun.
PyData Amsterdam, and I'm glad that this is happening.
Happy to sort of have you here. So that camera. Okay.